Okay, welcome to part two of this lecture in which we're going to do what we usually do, which is complicate our everyday ideas about the key concept of the week, in which case it is space and place. And we're going to begin with maps, because maps are often commonly perceived as scientific and therefore fully accurate representations of space and place. And there's this common understanding that the more knowledge we have acquired over time, the better maps we have developed, the more accurate our representation of place and space and the world is. But just as we introduced network theory, first of all, through what scientists are doing, we want to show you now what some social scientists and humanities and creative arts scholars have been thinking about for a long time now with regard to maps and how they think differently from scientists about what they represent. So our unexamined everyday assumptions about maps is that they are straightforward, objective representations of real places. Okay, you might have found when you tried to draw your region today, you drew what you felt was a poor map, but you probably, to you, have come to realize that it is a fully accurate map of your place, and in a subjective way, on the one hand. On the other hand, you probably are under the illusion that a complete and accurate map of Townsville can and does exist, perhaps if you just accessed it on the internet. And maybe you're just a shoddy map drawer. But let's think about that. Reflect on the map you just drew. The exercise is meant to demonstrate that places we are familiar with are usually more central on our map. We may know our town or region, but we don't know every crook and cranny of it. I don't know Cranbrook, for example, a suburb of Townsville. I almost never go there. Wolgaroo, I have really no idea at all. There's lots of areas I know I just never go to, and they're kind of blank spaces on my own cognitive map. Certain landmarks and landforms always take on significance. In the case of Townsville, Castle Hill. The Strand, Riverway, for example. Home and emotion endows certain places with meaning. Places we go to a lot will be in our mind more than those we don't go to, and our routes of travel, whether we go by foot, bike, bus, or car, also will influence our cognitive map of a place. Of course, you can't remember every house you pass and every tree. Some become landmarks of the imagination, and some become blind spots. Our ability to draw a map also draws on memory and a number of associations with place. Our frequency of encounter and familiarity, our emotional connections, our strong ties, our conceptual pictures of it. Maps we have probably seen before, road maps, transit maps, representational maps, tourist brochures, marketing maps, for example. These also overlay our vision of place and affect how we map it. So all of this is leading up to one of our next week's key concepts, which is narrative and communication. Maps is social scientists and as humanities and creative arts scholars tend to see them as they are representations. They are, in fact, narratives of a kind. They are not merely transparent scientific communication. And this is why your Wood and All reading was directed to you this week. And they point out that all maps are representations. And in fact, the statement that they make is there's no way to represent everything all at once on any map. There is no Archimedean point of reference. Now, an Archimedean point refers to a mathematical hypothetical principle, that there would be a hypothetical point from which an observer could objectively perceive or surveil all aspects of a physical object being observed from all angles at once, something that is three-dimensional, such as a globe. Now, so therefore, it's a hypothetical vantage point from which an observer could objectively perceive the entire subject of inquiry with a view of totality. Archimedes was a Greek mathematician who was rediscovered during the Enlightenment, and he argued that if you could stand on one solid point beyond the earth and had a long enough lever, you could find an immovable point with which certainty could be obtained about what the world looked like. An objective view of the whole could be perceived from this hypothetical spot in space. So this was about an inquiry about hypothetical objectivity and certainty, and trying to embrace the idea that you could survey the whole and the entirety of the earth in one go. And we call this a kind of panopticism, right? A term we learned last week, achieving that panoptic all-seeing eye, a point of view in which one is master of all I survey. Now, it apparently, this idea of the Archimedean point, it derived from Archimedes' alleged saying that if he had a fulcrum or lever long enough, and that situates this in the time that he's talking about, when people moved giant objects by levers and fulcrums, he could even move the earth. And so the Archimedean point, we must recognize, is a point outside from which a different, perhaps objective or true picture of something is obtainable. He even posited that it might be from outside time, a view from science, from elsewhere, perhaps a view of spatial reality from nowhere. Philosophers, both skeptical and anti-realist bents, as well as deflationists and minimalists, often claim that such an alleged standpoint is merely fantastical. So this is to say that despite how accurate we may think a map is, it's always going to be partial, and it's always going to be from a certain point of view. And this is true even with world maps. And this is something that the Wood and L reading got across, I think, quite well today. Now, most people consider this the definitive map of the world. It's actually the Mercator or Mercator map. And most people think, well, it's as accurate could be. But it too is an approximation. It's a representation. And so therefore it encodes things from particular points of view. In fact, the Mercator map was designed by sailors during the Age of Discovery, and it was so that they could use their tools of navigation in order to follow the meridians, north and south, latitude and longitude, to chart their way across expanses of ocean to ports of call. We still use this map. It's a hangover from a leftover time, even though most of us are never going to learn how to sail a ship. So in fact, it is a map that is actually taking a three-dimensional globe and transposing it to a two-dimensional representation. And so there's always going to be things that are squished and squashed when you do that. There's always going to be a choice that a map maker makes about what's central and what's peripheral. And indeed, there have been other maps that have been subsequently drawn up in the 20th and 21st century to try to demonstrate to people that the effect of the Mercator map that we've all been looking at for so long has actually got cognitive consequences in the ways that we view the size of the world, for example, the relative size and therefore the relative importance of the continents. And so the Peters map is not one that's designed for navigation. It's one designed to be able to explain to people the relative size of land masses. And by looking at the Peters map, we need to see that Africa as a continent is much, much larger than Europe as a continent, for example. We may see the relative largesse of Australia as well, and that the Antarctic is enormous, much more enormous than the Arctic zone as well. And we can see the relative size of Canada versus the United States. They're equal-ish in land mass, but have very different population sizes. And we can also do things like, put the size of China on the size of Australia and think about population differences. So they're very useful social tools to represent different things than simply navigation. Now, some people also think that the Peters map also encodes certain kinds of biases, and so they'll give us a flipped map where they've chosen to give us the south on top and the north on the bottom. There's no reason why we would always see the north on top and the south on the bottom. It's a globe. It's just spinning around in space. So, in fact, whilst the compass north points a particular way, and of course the compass south points a particular way because of the magnetism of the Earth, we don't need to draw north on top and south at the bottom. And the implication of doing so sometimes also means that we tend to think that the northern hemisphere is more important, whereas the southern hemisphere is not. But when you flip this around, you can see Australia suddenly has more prominence. And it seems to be more aligned with, for example, South Africa and Brazil, countries along the same latitude that we don't always think of as having a relationship with, for example. And we can also begin to recognize things about the dynamics of populations. For example, that the population of the global south, if we were going to transpose this to a population now, is exponentially larger than the population of the global north. So I'll show you a video on that later if you optionally want to watch it after this part of the lecture. So what we need to recognize, and I love etymology, not entomology, which is the study of insects, but etymology, the study of the history of words. And you'll probably hear me talk about it a lot. It's my bent as a literary scholar. But the word cartography can be broken down into two bits. It's from Greek, chartis, which means a chart or a map, that makes sense, and graphen, which means to write. So it is a kind of a narrative of place, and that's encoded in the word. Now we need to recognize that maps are both mirrors, so they represent a space and a place. They also shape our attitudes towards space and place, like so much art does too, right? They reflect how we see the world or our world, and they have power, especially because we do often believe them to be representations of reality, not just tools or lenses. So they inform and shape how we act and how we conceptualize space and place. But we need to remember that they're tools and they serve a purpose, and we're better at understanding maps and representations of place if we can begin to decode what the purpose of that map might be. So one thing we need to ask ourselves then, if a map is a narrative and it was written from a particular perspective for a particular purpose, whose perspective is a map written for or drawn for, and for what purpose? And these are the sorts of things that archaeologists would be fascinated by. But there's also people who study ancient maps. There's wonderful books you can pore over, even in the JCU Library collection, about maps of all kinds, fictional, factual, whatever that might mean in these circumstances. So this is an ancient map that can be found freely online in the National Library of Australia's Trove collection if you search their digitized images for maps. And this is a map you will soon recognize of the stars, right? This is the the horoscope system, where we have kind of mythological figures that have come to be dominant in the sky, or seen as shaping star systems in the sky, that could be seen in any given season and month. And that's where we get the myth or the lore that particular people born under particular stars have certain sets of personalities. I'm trying to find. You're probably looking at this too the same way I am right now. I'm trying to find my own image, and I can't find it right now, but I can find Sagittarius there, and I can find what else can I see? Sure, Aries, I think I see there somewhere else. Of course, the Scorpion, Scorpio. Someone who knows horoscopes better than I do would probably know what month of the year or what season of the year that's represented. But we know ultimately that this is a view of the star system from a particular season from the Northern Hemisphere. No one knows that more than somebody like me who moved to Australia from Canada as an adult. The stars in the Southern Hemisphere look completely different from a different perspective. They're bewildering at first, and that's one reason why, of course, we have the Southern Cross on the Australian flag. And it's a very distinct thing you see in the sky, and that navigators would have noticed from very early days when they were charting the seas to Australia. So we know this is a northern vision of the sky, and we know it's people who looked to the sky for all kinds of reasons, right? Probably for navigation purposes, but also then because they looked at it, needed it, and used it so much, just as we have with the Mercator map, they endowed this space with meaning. And they, of course, made cognitive maps of their relationship with it. And those cognitive maps of their relationships to space often shape how they then interact with and construct the built environment. So, for instance, theories of Stonehenge have come to understand that it was aligned with a solstice festival that was probably ritualistic, that people from far and wide in the area came to during solstice. And it was probably related with, praying for a good crop, for example, or fortune for the next season. Archaeologists, I'm sure, know the theories of Stonehenge far more than I do. But we can see that this is a group of people who cared about the seasons and who looked to the sky and oriented even their built environment about that. So looking at how people arrange their cognitive maps of the world tells us a lot about their values and also about their imagined geographies of all kinds. Now, that's a term that comes to us from a theorist you'll encounter if you ever take post-colonial literature with me, Edward Said, but he's also a theorist whom we'll encounter when we start to think about narrative and communication in a following week. So let's think then about this map and give those principles to it. Whose perspective is it drawn from? What's central? What's peripheral? What was it used for? Right in the very middle of it, you see a bunch of blue space. So yes, perhaps all roads do lead to Rome, because in the very middle of that blue space, you see Roma, which of course is Rome. Now, we know that sea-going ports were the easiest way to traverse space until, of course, the advent of the steam engine and the motor car. So the relationship with port cities was of incredible importance, we can tell, during this period. The word Mediterranean, if you want to start thinking about the etymology of that, means the middle of the earth. It's the sea in the middle of the earth. And we can tell that there's an ethnocentric view that this is the middle of the world, right? Just as apparently the two Mandarin characters that signify the word for China, which is it's a one character, it's a box with a square through it, means Middle Kingdom or middle of the world. To the Chinese, that's the center of the world. I've been told, although I've never seen the sign for it, but that the name in Mandarin for Canada means big empty, which basically just means wilderness. So again, you can see that they endow their symbols of the world with meaning. And we can see that this road, this ancient network of roads, they were called a via, which means the way. It's also related to the word the life. So the life way, the pathway, the way leading to something. Is a network probably between many of these port cities, and would also have been used not only for trade, but also probably to ensure that the empire was being policed and conquered, to outline the edges of this territory, which during the Roman Empire was enormous. So we began to think about how maps have ways of encoding imagined ideas, social ideas about place. But they also, of course, therefore have real social effects on people's attitudes towards place or people's interactions with space. So this was Aristotle's world. We're going back now far further than the Roman Empire. to the Greek Empire, and the time of Plato, of course. And this map is of great interest to us at James Cook University because if you click on that hyperlink below or look up State of the Tropics report at JCU, you'll see that under our Vice Chancellor Sandra Harding, she's a departing Vice Chancellor this year, we'll get a new one next year, her stamp that she placed on this institution, she wanted JCU to be the institution of the tropics. She didn't want us to be, the Oxford of the world. She felt America had enough universities, but she felt that when you look across the particular latitude between the Tropic of Capricorn and the Tropic of Cancer, which is the area known as the tropics, that James Cook University is probably the most prestigious and well-known university in the Western English-speaking world in that region. And she felt that we had a social responsibility, therefore, to engage in studies of the tropics, whether that would be the marine environment or the social environment, the scientific environment or the humanistic, social scientific, and creative arts environment, which is a fair enough mandate or mission statement to have. The thing she mentions in the State of the Tropics project and about the project is she says that there are still these ancient ideas about priority encoded in the way in which we see the world that have come to us all the way through from Aristotle's ordering of the world. And so this was a map by a cartographer called Andreas Castellarius. Excuse me if I've got my map. I'm sorry, my pronunciation wrong. It was published in 1660, so it is in Shakespeare's time. It's far beyond the time of Aristotle, but it did represent the Aristotelian view. And he divided the world into three zones. He said at the top and the very bottom, those cold spaces where we would see the Arctic and the Antarctic, that was the frigid zone. And he said between that was the temperate zone. And in the middle of that was what he called the torrid zone, the tropics, the terrible hot place. And he said, and you can guess what he said, the most favorable place to live that would lead a man to be able to use his faculties the best, and therefore by that he meant think well, reason well, have a good brain, would be the temperate zone, which is Europe. Now, if you think back to the map of the Mercator map we just looked at of Europe, and then you think back to the Peters map, we looked at relative size of continents of Europe, you can begin to see a few things happening, right? In the Mercator map shows us the prominence of Europe in that social world. The Atlantic Ocean and in Europe and America are what are right in the middle of that map. It's at the period of discovery when that map was developed, when people were moving between what was called the New World, which was North and South America, and what was then called First Empire, which was the Spanish, the Portuguese, and the British Empire. So people were moving that way. And Europe was seen as being, the conqueror of the New World, the discoverer of the New World. And you can see, therefore, why they organized the Mercator map that way. But you can also see when you think about the Peters map that actually the relative continental size of Europe, which Aristotle seemed to think was the most important place in the world, is tiny compared to the rest of the world. It's also interesting here that they always, from the ancient times, had a zone they called temperate australis, where they thought perhaps there was a zone beyond that torrid zone, south of the Tropic of Capricorn, where you could live. And in fact, those attitudes also were a hangover when Australia was settled by Europeans, and that they didn't think that it was worth living in places like the far north of Queensland because it was full of disease, pestilence, it was too hot. You couldn't conduct trade. And it's one explanation for why it was the southern cities, such as Sydney and Adelaide, for example, that were seen as more temperate, that were settled by Europeans first. So these representations of the world have real social effects and consequences, right? The other thing that we really need to think through, and one of your readings points out this week, is that maps also, of course, indicate, as we saw in the map of the Roman Empire, networks of mobility, but they also indicate networks of immobility, places people cannot go. So the periphery of the Roman Empire would have been policed and regulated. There would have been squadrons of soldiers who would have been sent to remote areas to enforce Roman rule, for example. And only if you were a Roman citizen would you have free pass to traverse those roads, for example. Now, passports are a thing that people often aren't aware weren't actually introduced until about 1920 in the aftermath of World War I. They are a very relatively new thing that you had to demonstrate that you had a pass to enter a particular country. So during that period of the rise of nationalism, particularly in a period in the aftermath where nationalism had terrible adverse effects in terms of conflict at war, but also where we had a lot of social infrastructure for mobility, for people, even of common classes, to be able to get on a boat and go somewhere, or go on a train if they could so afford, and the development of the road system people began to kind of, oh, wait a minute, like spies could come, they could be infiltrating, the communists could be infiltrating the capitalists. We need to regulate all of this for lots of social control reasons. And so the passport became not just a pass to travel, but a passport of immobility. If you did not have a particular passport, and still to this day, some passports are far more valuable than others. My brother, for example, who married somebody from the Caribbean, had to get married in the Caribbean, not because it was a destination wedding, but because his fiance's family could not travel. They could not get a visa to travel to North America, even if they were given the money to have passage to do so, because their visas do not allow them to travel to those places. And people who are from the developing world or the third world, who are refugees or asylum seekers, are very conscious about these issues. But I want to also point out that historical things actually change the way in which the whole map can sometimes get tilted or redesigned when things get shut down. And that's, of course, something we're all experiencing right now during the pandemic, which I'll touch on again just in a minute. But what a lot of people don't really know about this particular map is that this is, of course, a map of the Silk Road, also known as the spice routes. This is a time way before refrigeration. No more meat-eating species. If you wanted to preserve things that you slaughtered, sell them at market, you weren't going to kill people of pestilence. You needed to be able to preserve the things that you were trading and selling. And of course, silk that came from India and China was incredibly valuable at this time as a commodity as well. So this takes us to some of the history of the field of human geography, right? Human geographers are really interested in networks of mobility and human movement, migration, and diaspora, something that we'll revisit in Module 2 of this subject. They look at interactions between commodities and stuff and people and how that shapes routes and hubs and territory. They look at flows, mobility, immobility, and they're really interested in material culture. So the way in which things people made not only facilitated transport, but also got brought around the world, and studying the history of that. But from the interactions with the map, of course, any map, we can start to touch upon political, social, and cultural interactions with place and space, and these have changed historically. Now, the Silk Road was the major route of trade between the East and West from about 100 years before the birth of Christ, Common Era, to about 1450, Common Era, approximately. Okay, and silk and spice were the major commodities that traveled along these roads, and so they were trade routes. People needed to use these routes, and this area here, sorry, I should be explaining, there's 3 maps on this slide. The one to the right, the small one that I'm pointing at, I'm not sure if you can see it in the slide, that has Persia in the center of the world, and then India and China, shows you the overland maps that people during this period were able to traverse between East and West. But something in particular happened between, as this map below it shows, between 767 and 1912. Now, I did explain to you earlier that at this time we're seeing the rise of empires, of course, the Holy Roman Empire, the Persian Empire, for example, the Chinese Empire. But in general, the world was divided into spheres, such as the Christian sphere, Christendom, and the Muslim sphere, the Caliphate, for example. And Baghdad was a really critical city, just as Constantinople, which later became Istanbul when it was conquered by the Muslims, was a critical city too, because they were hub cities. They were hub cities that people used to traverse these really important spice and silk trade routes. And around the year 1912 or so, it started becoming besieged by, of course, this is the period of, I'm losing my words here, but you'll know what I'm talking about, the Crusades and various other aspects of danger that people would encounter along these routes. And so these routes for 1,000 years, the ones that were the silk and trade routes, didn't just carry with them silk and spice. They carried with them religion, ideas, technologies, paper, for example, diseases sometimes like the plague, DNA, babies were born, inter-ethnic marriage occurred. And sometimes people find when they do their DNA traces, they have very interesting social backgrounds. But this was the way, all of those things moved back and forth until about 1453, when the Ottoman Empire, which had conquered Constantinople that year, which was the eastern capital of Christendom. So by then, there had been Rome, which was becoming established as the western capital of Christendom, and Constantinople was the eastern one. And the Ottoman Empire conquered Constantinople in 1453 and closed it off to trade with the West. They no longer wanted religious ideas to be spread to the East in particular because it spread religious war and the Crusades and some of these other things that moved along. And so they just closed off that hub. The closing of those two hubs of Baghdad and also of Constantinople, many people don't realize was actually an instigator or a trigger for the Age of Discovery. So Vasco da Gama was the navigator for the Portuguese who began to explore trade routes around the Cape of Good Hope, around Cape Town, going from Portugal to India and China to try to still maintain trade despite the fact that overland routes were closed. And of course, Christopher Columbus, who was navigating for the Spanish, sought a trade route the other way across the Atlantic Ocean. And that led to the 1492 so-called discovery of the Americas. So you can see how mobility and immobility and political effects actually change the map. And that's why historical atlases are so fascinating to look at. So maps have social effects, and they are representations of social attitudes. But one of the things that we also need to recognize about them is that they are always, no matter how accurate our instruments of measurement are, they are approximations. And this can be demonstrated no better than the coastline paradox. So the idea of the coastline paradox is the closer you get to the coast of any landmass, the harder it is to measure. There's more space to measure the closer up you get. Lines are theoretical. They're something that comes to us from Euclidean mathematics. They're mere approximations. And the closer you get up to land masses, the more you see they're usually not very linear at all. But the idea that they are has material effects in terms of where we decide these days in particular in modern nation states to transpose borders on nations. They also have material effects in the way that we imagine place as big or small, of course. So again, after this part of the lecture, I'll give you this link to watch. So maps have effects, both real and imagined. Some of you will will recognize this map from the left from Tyndale. Tyndale was one of the first to map the language groups of the First Nations of Australia. And what's fascinating to me about looking at that First Nations map of Australia, it looks a lot more like Europe. It's not filled with Euclidean space. It's filled with more nebulous, sort of natural ways that humans expand territory, spread, contest, probably formed around landmarks such as oceans, mountains, routes. Of course, the Tyndale map is contestable itself. It has been an object of scrutiny and controversy around First Nations land claims because it isn't accurate. It also only shows from his limited point of view. But it's useful to look at in contrast to the map that we now have of the states and territories of Federated or Commonwealth Australia, where you can see that our borders are very Euclidean, very left and right and up and down. And for the most part, these borders pre-pandemic didn't really mean much to us. They were just governance areas. They have different state governments and different laws. So if you get in trouble with a law, you find out that those borders mean something. But other than that, many of us have had the experience of, you drive across the Queensland to New South Wales border and go, it seems pretty much the same here. I expected it to be different. And it's then when you realize that these are, to a certain extent, arbitrary lines that have been made. Now, of course, people have been designing space for a very long time. Along with the design of this space, such as the Euclidean borders around the states of Australia, there isn't some nefarious plan to regulate people. Although sometimes, arguably that could be so. For instance, every major city in Australia has a road called Boundary Road, and that was the boundary beyond which Native people were not allowed to enter. So if you were First Nations in Australia, you were meant to stay out in the back beyond, and you weren't meant to come into the city. And so, of course, even the so-called ideal states of Australia sometimes had nefarious effects, of course, on certain people. They were designed to be ideal from one particular perspective. But look at these two different ideal towns. One from the Middle Ages, and one from, I think this is 1922, Walter Burley Griffin's winning design for the capital of Australia. And what do we notice straight away about the difference of these ideal towns? One is surrounded by water. One takes water fortification and water navigation very seriously. We can also see it's a military state. It's highly protected. It has a drawbridge up and down, so control routes that you can close off against invasion. It has barracks, places where people would live, places where they would worship, places where they would work. places where they would grow produce, for example. So you can tell what was important in that ideal town. Now let's look at this 1922 city and environs of the Commonwealth of Australia. We can already start to see the episteme of networks, right? We can see this is not a place where water really mattered except for in a decorative way. So it's all organized around Lake Burley Griffin, but that's not because people take boats to get places. You can see that it's a network of hubs that represent the different regions of the city of Canberra, often associated with different arms of government or different state institutions as well. And we can see that this is one that's based on a road network as well. So one of the things to really point out, I think, at this point is that the way that we interact with space and place and the way that we imagine place and space actually can have substantial material effects that stamp themselves on the actual land, right? So on the one hand, sometimes you can cross the border and go, oh, I feel like I'm still in the same place. Except for now they're asking to see our vaccine passports or our, visa passports to, regulate COVID. In the past, landscape has been regulated and controlled not just by the imposition of things like drawbridges or port cities, or then later on let me correct myself, Walter Burley Griffith's 1912 winning design of Canberra, where road systems became important. Colonization was a really important part of stamping land with values, stamping what they saw as new territories with imported ways of being. So this is Jakarta, which is now part of Indonesia, an independent state, but was historically Dutch. And what are the Dutch known for? They're known for canals. They're also known for their tulips, right? They were known for their agriculture. And so you can see how they designed the city of Batavia to have access to boats. This is prior to the development of substantial road networks, certainly way before cars. You can see that it had one main port of entry that could be guarded and fortified. You've got guard stations there. The large ships are out in a deep harbor. So that controls where you enter from, what's considered the front, what's considered the back. And you can see this Euclidean space that's even designing the way that they are importing farming techniques at this time. Now, of course, you can also, see, in the tourist representations of places like this, how we celebrate this sometimes with a sense of colonial nostalgia. But the reality is the average person in Jakarta remains very poor. So even the very city design, the colonial design, that was stamped on itself in 1780 by colonists has material effects that persist to today in ways not unlike those historical poverty maps that we addressed at the beginning of this lecture. So the point is that routes and the way we navigate landscape change our experience of landscape or waterways. Now, some of you might look at this picture and think, oh, how dreamy, that's a place of escape. It takes me into the country. But one thing we need to recognize is the road systems in Australia or anywhere in the world are so new when it comes to the history of the world and the way we navigated space and place, which historically was via waterways principally. And so it's profoundly changed our way of seeing and encountering space, even the wilderness. And of course, people have traded by overland land routes, as I've suggested, and as we will continue to think about when we talk about song lines in a further lecture. But just wanted to recognize here that this route it's a bitumen road, and it has therefore been imposed post the advent of the Model T motor car in the 1920s, and it's profoundly had an effect on the way that we have experienced landscape. So here's some ways that we can begin to think about how road networks also have shaped our experience of place and space. And we'll end this part of the lecture here and show you a few more videos, and then you can continue on should you wish to, and follow up with social theories of space and place in the next part of this lecture.